The calm before the storm. The Horizon was no ordinary club. Its very name carried a weight, a promise of exclusivity, of status, and of untouchable wealth. The club sprawled across the city's skyline like a gilded fortress, a beacon that drew the city's elite to its doors night after night. The lavish decor was the very definition of opulence. Towering glass windows that looked out onto the twinkling lights of the city, soft velvet chairs, and tables made from marble imported from Italy. But for all its beauty and grandeur, the Horizon was not just a place. It was a symbol of something much larger, something that would shake the course of Elijah's life. The evening was in full swing when Elijah arrived for his shift. He had always been punctual, a characteristic that earned him a bit of respect from his colleagues, but more than that, it was part of his quiet ambition. He never wanted to stand out too much. He knew his place. In the grand scheme of things, he was just another cog in the machine, a young man in a long line of servers who moved in and out of the club, always unnoticed. Still, there were moments, fleeting though they were, when he allowed himself to dream of a different life. One where he didn't have to kneel before the gods of wealth and privilege. One where he could stand on his own 2 feet, free from the burden of servitude. But tonight, as Elijah entered the Horizon's bustling entrance hall, the weight of that dream seemed heavier than ever. He couldn't help but feel it. The silent acknowledgement that the people around him had everything he could ever want. The guests milled about, laughing, clinking their glasses, their laughter echoing through the grand hall as they basked in the privilege that wealth brought them. To them, the club was just another venue to show off their latest acquisitions, cars, clothes, and, of course, their importance. Elijah moved seamlessly through the crowd, his face an expression of professional indifference, his hand steady as he took drink orders and delivered them to the guests with an ease that had been cultivated over months of practice. He passed by the gold-leafed pillars, the delicate flower arrangements, and the glittering chandeliers, all the while feeling like he was invisible to the guests, like a shadow that flitted between their conversations and laughter. He had grown used to it, the way the guests seemed to look right through him. To them, Elijah wasn't a person. He was part of the scenery, just another piece of the luxurious puzzle that made up the Horizon. He didn't mind, or at least he told himself he didn't. This was his job. This was what he had to do to get by. And one day, he told himself, he would make it out of this world, this endless cycle of servitude. But it wasn't just the anonymity that wore him down. It was the way some of the guests treated him. The casual cruelty that flowed from their mouths like poison. The subtle, but pointed, remarks about the service. The looks that said without words, "You don't belong here." Elijah's heart sometimes sank when he saw it. The way they looked down on him without even realizing it, or worse, without caring. He would never say it aloud, but there were times when he wished they would acknowledge him, see him as something more than a body in a tuxedo. Tonight, however, something was different. Elijah had a feeling, an unsettling sense in his gut, that this evening wouldn't pass quietly like the others. It wasn't that the crowd seemed any different. The same faces were there, all dressed in expensive suits and gowns, sipping cocktails, exchanging pleasantries. But there was an energy in the air that made the usual hum of the party feel like a ticking clock, each passing second a step toward something inevitable. He was walking toward the poolside when he felt a tap on his shoulder. He turned to find one of his fellow servers, Sarah, a young woman who had worked at the Horizon for just a few weeks longer than Elijah. She had an easy smile and was known for her ability to navigate the ins and outs of the club with effortless grace. "Hey, Elijah," Sarah said, her voice light. "You're looking a little tense tonight. Everything okay?" Elijah managed a small smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Yeah, just tired, I guess. It's been a long day." Sarah raised an eyebrow, her gaze scanning the room. "Yeah, I know what you mean. But tonight feels different. Something's in the air, you know. It's like people are just waiting for something to happen." Elijah didn't respond immediately. He just nodded. There was truth to Sarah's words. He could feel it too. There was a strange electricity in the atmosphere, a buzz that was more than just the usual noise of clinking glasses and idle chatter. It felt almost as if the crowd was on the edge of something, teetering just out of sight of the inevitable. "I guess we'll see," Elijah said, turning his gaze toward the guests at the pool. He quickly busied himself with taking an order from one of the nearby tables. Sarah watched him for a moment before moving off to her own duties, leaving Elijah to his thoughts. As he walked toward the bar to pick up a fresh tray of drinks, the laughter of the crowd grew louder, more boisterous. He glanced up to see a group of young men in designer suits, their faces bright with amusement, their attention focused on something happening near the pool. Elijah's curiosity piqued. He made his way closer, trying to see what had captured their attention. At the center of the attention was a tall man, impeccably dressed, with a look of confidence that bordered on arrogance. He stood laughing with his friends, surrounded by an entourage of wealthy socialites. One of his companions, a woman with a sleek, platinum blonde bob, was speaking animatedly to him, her hand gesturing wildly in the air. They were all enjoying themselves, their laughter loud and unrestrained. But then Elijah saw it. One of the men, his features sharp and unremarkable, had turned toward him. His eyes met Elijah's for just a brief moment, then moved to the drinks Elijah was carrying. Without warning, the man reached forward, grabbing Elijah by the collar of his white shirt and yanking him toward the pool. The action was so sudden, so unexpected, that Elijah didn't have time to react. Before he could even process what was happening, the man shoved him hard into the pool. The cool shock of the water against his skin took Elijah by surprise. For a split second, the world seemed to stop. The surface of the pool rippled around him as he sank into the water, his heart racing in confusion. He struggled to regain his balance and push himself to the surface, gasping for air, but the laughter from the crowd above him was deafening. He could hear them clearly now, the mocking jeers, the cruel words. They had found a new form of entertainment, and Elijah was the unwitting star. His hands trembled as he wiped the water from his face, feeling the weight of the moment bearing down on him. He had been humiliated in front of these people, and worse, he knew it would go unnoticed, dismissed as part of the entertainment. But as he stood there, drenched and humiliated, he couldn't help but think of one thing. How much longer would he allow himself to be treated like this? How much longer would he let these people define his worth? The crowd around the pool, once so lively, had now grown quiet. The laughter had died down, replaced by whispers. Elijah stood there, the weight of their stares heavy on his shoulders, and he realized that tonight was the night things would change. He wasn't sure how, but he knew that something was different. And then, just as the humiliation seemed like it might swallow him whole, the sound of footsteps approaching broke the tension. The laughter faded, and in its place, an unfamiliar, commanding presence filled the air. It was Richard Maddox, the billionaire's arrival. The room, once filled with laughter and high-pitched chatter, fell eerily silent. Elijah, standing in the pool with water dripping from his soaked clothes, felt the weight of the moment like never before. The sting of humiliation was fresh, but there was a coldness creeping into his heart, an unfamiliar anger that began to simmer beneath the surface. He was used to the cruelty of those who lived above him, those who treated him as nothing more than an accessory to their lives of luxury. But tonight, as he stood there in front of them, he felt something stirring deep within him, a desire to fight back, to stand up, to demand something different. But before his thoughts could fully form, the crowd began to shift. Elijah barely had time to take in the movement before he realized why. The heavy, rhythmic footsteps of someone approaching the pool broke through the quiet murmur. At first, Elijah wasn't sure who it was. The sound was so deliberate, so commanding, it almost felt as though the earth itself was shifting under his feet. As the crowd parted, a tall figure emerged, his presence undeniable, almost magnetic. His impeccably tailored suit, a deep charcoal gray with a subtle sheen, caught the light as he walked. His face was strong, sharp, yet there was an almost uncanny stillness to it, a gaze that seemed to pierce through anyone it rested upon. Richard Maddox had arrived. The billionaire's reputation preceded him everywhere he went. His rise from a self-made man to one of the most powerful business magnates in the world was the stuff of legend. But he wasn't just another arrogant, untouchable millionaire. Richard Maddox was known for his deep sense of integrity, for the way he used his wealth to make an impact, whether through philanthropic efforts or by challenging the system that allowed people like the ones who humiliated Elijah to flourish unchecked. His name carried weight, and with it, an aura of authority that was impossible to ignore. Elijah's eyes flickered toward Maddox, who, even in the midst of this extravagant crowd, had an air of quiet control. The billionaire's eyes scanned the room, but they didn't linger on the guests like most people did. Instead, they seemed to focus on something deeper, something that made his presence all the more commanding. And then his eyes fell on Elijah. The two locked eyes for a brief moment, and in that instant, Elijah felt something shift. It wasn't pity, nor was it sympathy. It was something else, something far stronger. Maddox's gaze was steady, unflinching, as if he saw right through Elijah's humiliation and straight into the core of who he was. Elijah didn't know what to do with that look. He had spent years learning how to be invisible, how to disappear into the background, how to keep his head down. But in that moment, under Maddox's gaze, he felt seen for the first time in years, not for the servant he was in the eyes of the others, but for the person he truly was. Richard Maddox took another step forward, his every movement deliberate, yet effortless. The crowd's murmurs grew louder as the billionaire continued to walk towards Elijah. The young waiter, still standing in the pool, could feel his heart pounding. Every part of his body was screaming for him to retreat, to hide away from the impending confrontation, but something within him kept him rooted to the spot. He was no longer that invisible figure, the servant who silently accepted whatever cruel fate was handed to him. He was, for the first time, a man who would not let his dignity be stripped away. As Maddox reached the edge of the pool, the room seemed to hold its collective breath. The laughter that had filled the air moments earlier had vanished entirely, replaced by a charged silence. Even the man who had shoved Elijah into the pool now stood frozen, his face pale as he realized what was happening. No one dared to make a sound. The billionaire stood there for a moment, sizing up the situation. His sharp eyes swept over the waterlogged Elijah, and then, without breaking his gaze, he turned his attention to the group of people gathered by the pool. A cold, calculated silence followed, as Maddox's presence alone was enough to command the room. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Richard Maddox spoke, his voice low and steady, but carrying a weight that seemed to push against the walls of the room. Who did this? His words were simple, direct, and yet they seemed to reverberate in the air, forcing the crowd to shift uneasily. For a long moment, no one moved. No one spoke. The man who had pushed Elijah into the pool, his face now flushed with guilt and fear, attempted to look away, but it was too late. The eyes of the billionaire were on him, unyielding, unwavering. The rest of the guests stood by in stunned silence, unsure of how to react. Maddox's eyes narrowed, his voice turning colder, more intense. "I'll ask again. Who did this?" The young man who had shoved Elijah, a man named Gavin, slowly raised his hand. His arrogance had crumbled beneath the weight of Maddox's presence. He stammered, his voice barely audible as he spoke. I didn't think it would be a big deal. It was just a joke." Maddox took a slow step forward, his eyes never leaving Gavin's face. "A joke," he echoed, the word dripping with disdain. Humiliation is not a joke. Disrespect is not a joke. And making someone feel small, making them feel less than human, that's not humor. That's cruelty. Gavin, still stunned by the turn of events, could only stutter incoherently in response. The crowd around them shifted nervously, the once vibrant atmosphere now replaced by a tense, suffocating silence. Elijah remained still in the pool, water dripping from his clothes as he watched the scene unfold. He was caught between two emotions, relief and disbelief. The crowd that had once laughed at his expense was now holding its breath, watching in stunned awe as Richard Maddox addressed the situation with an intensity that seemed to challenge everything they had ever known about power and authority. Maddox, his gaze still fixed on Gavin, raised a hand to silence the growing murmurs of the crowd. If you think you can get away with dehumanizing someone just because you have money, or power, or status, you're wrong. He turned his head slightly, eyes sweeping over the remaining guests. This behavior will not be tolerated, not in my presence, not anywhere. The weight of his words hung in the air like a heavy fog, and for the first time that evening, the guests realized that Maddox wasn't just a businessman. He was someone who would hold people accountable for their actions. He was someone who didn't just play by the rules of the elite. He created his own. Elijah, still standing in the pool, couldn't tear his eyes away from the billionaire. This wasn't the Richard Maddox he had heard about in the tabloids or seen on the covers of magazines. This was a man who stood up for what was right, who didn't cower in the face of wealth or power. He was a force, an undeniable presence that commanded respect without needing to say a word. But just as the tension in the room seemed to reach its peak, Maddox did something unexpected. He turned back to Elijah, his expression softening. His gaze, though intense, now held an understanding, an unspoken connection between the two of them. "Come," Maddox said, extending his hand toward Elijah. The young waiter hesitated for a moment, but then, with a trembling hand, he reached out and took the billionaire's hand. The crowd watched in silence, the scene unfolding before them like something from another world. Elijah was helped out of the pool with a strength and grace that seemed to erase the last remnants of humiliation. Maddox stood before Elijah, his eyes steady and reassuring. "You don't deserve this," he said softly, his voice filled with genuine care. "You have more dignity in your little finger than most of these people have in their entire bodies." For the first time that night, Elijah felt a spark of something other than embarrassment or anger. He felt seen. He felt valued. And in that moment, something inside of him shifted, something powerful, something that had been buried beneath the surface for years. The guests, now silent and unsure of what to do, watched as the billionaire stood beside the young waiter. The power dynamic had shifted in an instant. Richard Maddox had not only defended Elijah, he had shown the world that wealth, power, and status meant nothing if they weren't backed by integrity and humanity. Elijah's life had just changed forever. The shock of a lifetime. The scene at the horizon had transformed completely. What had begun as a night of high society revelry and shallow entertainment was now a moment of reckoning, a confrontation that would forever change the lives of everyone present. Elijah stood by the side of Richard Maddox, his clothes still dripping wet, his heart racing from the shock of it all. He could hardly believe what had just transpired. The laughter, the cruel remarks, and the humiliation had all seemed like the natural order of things, a routine Elijah had come to expect whenever he found himself in spaces like this, surrounded by people who saw him as nothing more than a servant. But in the span of a few minutes, everything had changed. Richard Maddox, the billionaire whose name carried the weight of untold influence, had not only intervened in Elijah's defense, but he had also placed himself between Elijah and the mockery of the elite. And now, as the tension in the room simmered, the guests seemed unsure of what to do, unsure of how to react to the stunning shift in the evening's power dynamics. The silence stretched, palpable, as though everyone in the room was waiting for something to happen, but no one knew exactly what. Elijah stood there, frozen in disbelief, his mind still catching up to the unfolding events. The presence of Richard Maddox beside him felt like both a shield and a challenge, a promise that the moment of his humiliation was not going to be allowed to slide into the shadows. And then, Just as the room seemed to hold its collective breath, Maddox spoke again. His voice was calm but filled with a quiet authority that demanded the room's attention. "I don't think you fully understand the gravity of what just happened here," he said, his gaze sweeping across the crowd. "What was done to Elijah was not a mistake. It wasn't an accident. It was a deliberate act of cruelty, and it won't be tolerated. Not in my presence, and certainly not in any space I control." The guests remained silent, their eyes shifting from Maddox to each other. Some looked embarrassed, others nervous, but no one spoke. The power of the billionaire's words hung heavy in the air. Maddox paused for a moment, allowing the weight of his statement to settle in. He turned back to Elijah, who stood still, his gaze on the ground. The young man's hand still trembled slightly, a mix of disbelief, relief, and something else, a growing sense of recognition. Elijah had always kept his head down, always taken the punches and the insults without ever daring to dream of something different. But now, standing beside Richard Maddox, he felt a stir of hope, something that had been absent in his life for as long as he could remember. It was as if, in that one moment, everything he had been taught to accept, the inequality, the injustice, the discrimination, had been upended. Elijah's eyes met Maddox's, and for a brief moment, it felt as though the billionaire was offering him something much more than just his protection. It was a quiet invitation, an invitation to step into a world where he didn't have to live in the shadows, where his worth wasn't defined by the label others had placed on him. There was something in Maddox's eyes, something unspoken, that told Elijah he was meant for more than this. But before he could fully grasp the magnitude of the moment, Maddox's voice broke through his thoughts. "You're not just a waiter, Elijah," Maddox said, his words sharp but compassionate. "You're a person, and people like you, people with dignity, deserve better, and I intend to make sure you get it." The statement echoed in the room like a challenge, and for the first time that night, the crowd seemed to shift in response. The sneers, the judgment, the undercurrent of superiority that had pervaded the atmosphere, it all seemed to falter under the weight of Maddox's words. No one in that room had expected this. No one had expected the billionaire to defend a young waiter with such unwavering conviction. And yet there was Elijah, standing in the center of it all, his mind still reeling, trying to process the enormity of the moment. Richard Maddox wasn't just offering sympathy. He was offering Elijah a kind of power, a kind of voice he had never known before. Elijah didn't know what to say, didn't know how to respond. For years, he had been quiet, had been taught that his place in life was to serve, to remain unseen, to never speak out of turn. But tonight, with Maddox's words still hanging in the air, something had shifted within him. He felt a new sense of self-worth, something he hadn't known in years. It wasn't just about standing up to those who had humiliated him. It was about something much bigger, the realization that he didn't have to accept the treatment he had endured for so long. Maddox didn't wait for a response from Elijah. Instead, he turned back to the crowd. "You're all here because of what you think you've earned. The wealth, the status, the power." His voice was colder now, cutting through the air with each word. "But there's one thing I know for certain. No amount of money can buy integrity. And the lack of it is what separates the truly powerful from the rest of you." The billionaire's gaze swept across the room, his words hitting like a hammer, forcing the guests to confront something they had long chosen to ignore: their own moral failings. The words lingered, a subtle yet undeniable condemnation of everything they had allowed to flourish in their world. For some, it was a moment of awakening. For others, it was a blow to the ego they hadn't been prepared for. As the tension built, Maddox finally turned his attention back to Elijah. "I don't want you to leave here feeling like you're lesser than anyone. You're better than this." Elijah, still processing the weight of the billionaire's words, nodded slowly. For the first time that evening, a sense of calm washed over him, though it was mixed with confusion. He had never expected anything like this. In his wildest dreams, he had never imagined that someone like Richard Maddox, a man who moved through the world with such authority, would care enough to speak up for someone like him. The crowd, still reeling from the abrupt turn of events, began to stir, their unease palpable. No one quite knew what to do. The usual social rituals of laughter, mingling, and small talk seemed meaningless now. The event, once designed to showcase wealth and privilege, had been upended by something far more powerful, the assertion of human dignity. At that moment, Richard Maddox did something that stunned everyone in the room. He extended an offer to Elijah that no one saw coming. "I want you to come work for me," Maddox said, his voice ringing out with finality. "Not here, not as a waiter. I want you to work with me on something bigger. You've got something special, Elijah. I see it, and I won't let this world you're living in define you." The offer hung in the air, as though it was more than just a job proposition. It was a challenge, an invitation to step into a new world. Elijah stood in shock, his heart racing, the implications of what Maddox was offering him slowly sinking in. It was more than a job. It was a chance at a life that could change everything. The possibilities were endless. And yet, despite the whirlwind of thoughts in his mind, Elijah couldn't help but feel a sense of uncertainty. Could he really leave the only life he had ever known? Could he trust someone like Maddox, who had stepped into his world so suddenly? Before Elijah could find his voice, Maddox gave him a reassuring nod. "Take your time," he said. "But know this, the world doesn't have to be what it's always been. You can change your path, Elijah. You just need to choose to walk it." The offer was there. The question was no longer if he could do it. It was whether he had the courage to take the first step. As the room remained silent, Elijah felt something shift within him. The fire that had been smoldering inside him, ignited by the humiliation of the evening, was now burning brighter. He wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in his life, he knew that whatever happened next, he wasn't going to let anyone define him again. A new path. The night had shifted, irrevocably, from a celebration of wealth and arrogance to something else entirely. The laughter that once echoed through the expansive hall had now been replaced by murmurs of disbelief. Guests who had once looked at Elijah with disdain or indifference now looked at him with a mix of curiosity and confusion, as if the very foundation of their world had been cracked open in a single moment. Richard Maddox had done something few in that room had ever dared to do. He had not only stepped in to defend Elijah, but he had also extended an invitation to a life beyond the gilded cage they had all been living in. Elijah stood there, still soaking wet, his heart pounding in his chest. Richard Maddox's words hung in the air, their weight pressing down on him. "I want you to come work for me," the billionaire had said. "Not here. Something bigger." Elijah couldn't quite believe it. He had spent most of his life feeling like a small cog in an endless machine, a man defined by his job and the place others had carved out for him. But Maddox's offer was different. It wasn't about climbing a ladder of servitude. It was about something deeper, an opportunity to redefine himself, to step into a world he had once thought was closed off to him. But as the shock of the moment began to wear off, a new set of questions emerged in Elijah's mind. Could he really take this leap? Could he leave behind everything he had known, his family, his friends, the life he had fought so hard to build? He had never dreamed of anything like this before. He was a waiter. That was all he had ever been. The idea of moving into a world that had once seemed so distant, so unattainable, was overwhelming. And yet, something inside him urged him to take that step, to trust in the possibility of something more. Richard Maddox, noticing Elijah's hesitation, took a small step closer. "You don't have to answer right away," Maddox said, his voice calm but insistent. "But I want you to know that this is not a favor. This is an opportunity, a chance to build something for yourself. Don't let this world keep you in a box." Elijah, still dripping wet, took a deep breath, forcing himself to focus. The weight of the decision ahead of him was heavy, but the path before him felt clear. He had lived in the shadows for so long, But now, for the first time in his life, he felt as though he had been given a chance to step into the light. The silence in the room stretched on, but Elijah finally found his voice. I don't know what to say," Elijah began, his voice shaking slightly, though he could feel the growing confidence in his words. This is beyond anything I've ever imagined. I've never had the kind of life you're offering. I don't know if I'm even capable of stepping into that world. I've never been anything more than a waiter." Maddox's eyes softened, and he nodded in understanding. "Elijah, I've seen the way you carry yourself. The way you treat people. That's something that can't be bought or learned. You have it within you. You just need someone to see it. And I see it in you." For a moment, Elijah was silent. Maddox's words resonated deep within him. It wasn't just about the job, or the money, or the power. It was about dignity, respect. The kind of respect Elijah had longed for, but had never known could be offered by people like him. People who had power, wealth, and status. People who had always been the ones to look down on him. But Richard Maddox was different. The billionaire was offering Elijah something he hadn't dared to hope for. The chance to be someone, to be seen as more than just an accessory to someone else's life. He was offering him a chance at independence, at self-respect, at freedom. Elijah swallowed hard, his throat tight with emotion. He thought about his mother, about everything she had sacrificed for him. He thought about the struggles they had endured, the way they had scraped by on the edge of poverty. He thought about all the dreams he had buried deep within himself, afraid to reach for them because he thought they were beyond his grasp. And now, standing in front of a man who had the power to change his life forever, he realized that maybe those dreams weren't as distant as he had once thought. "I'll do it," Elijah said, his voice firm now, the decision made. "I'll work for you. I don't know where it will take me, but I'm willing to try." Richard Maddox smiled, a rare, genuine smile that reached his eyes. "That's all I'm asking for, Elijah. A chance to try." For a moment, the world seemed to stand still. Elijah felt as though he had just crossed a threshold, stepping into a new reality where the possibilities were endless. He wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in his life, he felt as though he could shape it for himself. It wasn't just about the job. It was about taking control of his own destiny. The guests around the pool, who had once been so eager to watch the spectacle unfold, now stood in stunned silence. They had witnessed the humiliation of a young man, and they had watched as he was lifted up, not by pity, but by the belief of a man who saw something in him that they had failed to see. And now, in the wake of the moment, they were left to confront the truth, that wealth, power, and status meant nothing if they weren't backed by decency, integrity, and the ability to see people for who they truly were. Elijah's gaze shifted from Maddox to the guests, who had begun to murmur amongst themselves. Their expressions were a mixture of guilt, unease, and, for some, shame. It was clear that the shift in power wasn't just about the momentary conflict with Gavin. It was about the way their entire worldview had been disrupted. Richard Maddox had not only called out the injustice in the room, but he had also shown them all that true power was not about control or dominance. It was about lifting others up. As Elijah's mind continued to process the enormity of the moment, Maddox turned to the crowd, his voice calm but carrying an authority that silenced everything around him. "Let this be a lesson to all of you," Maddox said, his words resonating through the room. "This is not just about money. This is about integrity. This is about character. And if you cannot see that, if you cannot respect the people who make your life possible, then you are not welcome here." The guests exchanged uncertain glances, but no one dared to challenge him. The billionaire's words were final, a declaration that the rules had changed. For some, it was a wake-up call. For others, it was a reminder of how fragile their positions truly were. Elijah could feel the weight of their gazes on him, but it didn't matter. He had made his decision. He had chosen to walk a different path. And as he stood there, side by side with Richard Maddox, He knew that whatever came next, he was no longer the invisible figure he had once been. The world, for the first time in his life, seemed open to him, and it was his to shape. The road less traveled. The days following that pivotal moment at the horizon felt like a blur to Elijah. Every day, as he went through the motions of his shift at the club, he kept replaying Richard Maddox's offer in his mind. The words felt surreal, still echoing in the quiet corners of his thoughts, urging him to act, to make a decision that would alter the course of his life forever. When he had agreed to work for Maddox, it had been with a sense of uncertainty. But now, as the time drew closer for him to leave the horizon behind, that uncertainty began to feel like a weight he couldn't carry. What would life be like on the other side? He had always been a waiter. His family had always been in the background, their lives revolving around survival, making do with what they had. What could a young man like him, from a working-class neighborhood, possibly have to offer to someone as influential and successful as Richard Maddox? The doubt crept in, gnawing at him with every step he took. But no matter how often Elijah replayed the scenario in his head, one thing remained clear. He could no longer ignore the opportunity that had been handed to him. He had been seen for the first time, not as an invisible servant, but as someone with potential, with value, and that realization sparked something within him, something he hadn't allowed himself to feel before. Hope. Richard Maddox had given him more than just a job. He had given him the chance to reinvent himself, to stop being defined by the place he had come from, the labels others had placed on him, and instead choose his own path. But as the days passed, the realities of leaving his old life behind began to hit Elijah. He had to break free of everything he had ever known. His home, his routine, his friends. There were moments when doubt crept in, moments when he felt paralyzed by fear. Was he ready? Could he really succeed in a world so far removed from the one he had known? It was one afternoon, just before sunset, when Elijah stood in front of his small apartment, looking at the door to the life he was about to leave behind. He had never been one to dream of wealth or power, never been someone who aspired to climb to the top of some invisible ladder. But now, as he looked back at the place that had housed his hopes and his struggles, he realized something. This apartment, these walls, had shaped him, but they had also confined him. He had been living in a box, and he was ready to step out of it. He placed his hand on the doorknob, giving the door one last look before he stepped outside. A sense of finality washed over him. There was no going back. This was it. This was the beginning of a new chapter in his life, and there would be no turning back to the comfort of the familiar. The first few days with Maddox were a whirlwind. Elijah was introduced to a new world, one that was both awe-inspiring and intimidating. The office where Maddox worked was housed in a sleek, glass and steel building, an architectural marvel that stretched into the sky, symbolic of the power and influence that Richard Maddox wielded. It was a world of high stakes and big decisions, a world where the sound of keyboards clicking and phones ringing was constant, and where every conversation held the weight of importance. Elijah was given a desk of his own, tucked away in a corner of the office, where he could watch the world outside the windows. But no matter how grand the building, no matter how many high-powered individuals surrounded him, Elijah couldn't help but feel out of place. He had been serving drinks in a club just days ago. Now he was sitting behind a desk, surrounded by people in expensive suits, discussing mergers, acquisitions, and global markets. It all felt so foreign. But Richard Maddox had given him a purpose, a role that went beyond simple administrative tasks. Elijah wasn't just another employee. He was involved. Maddox took the time to explain the intricacies of his work, of the business, and most importantly, the vision he had for it all. He encouraged Elijah to ask questions, to offer ideas, and to push past the limits he had imposed on himself. And though Elijah struggled at first to adapt to this new life, something within him began to change. He found himself staying late at the office, poring over reports and documents, trying to understand the intricacies of the decisions that shaped the world around him. He asked questions, some more daring than others, and Maddox, to his surprise, encouraged it. He never once treated Elijah as anything less than a valuable member of the team, and with every passing day, the young man's confidence grew. But the transformation wasn't easy. Elijah faced moments of intense self-doubt. In meetings, when everyone around him seemed so confident, so sure of themselves, Elijah felt the weight of being the outsider. He had never been in this kind of world before, and there were times when he felt like an imposter, as though someone might pull back the curtain and expose him for what he really was, just a young man from a humble background who didn't belong in these circles. It wasn't just the work that challenged him. It was the people. He had come from a world where people like him were expected to stay in their place, expected to serve and be seen, but never truly heard. But in this new world, everyone had a voice. Every idea, every contribution seemed to hold weight, and Elijah felt the pressure of that. Could he really keep up with people who had spent their lives in boardrooms, negotiating deals, making decisions that could alter the course of entire industries? But then, one day, Richard Maddox called him into his office. The walls were lined with floor-to-ceiling windows, offering a breathtaking view of the city below. Elijah entered hesitantly, but when Maddox looked up from his desk and smiled, the young man felt the weight of his nerves begin to dissipate. "I've been watching you," Maddox said, his voice steady and encouraging. "You've come a long way since that night at the Horizon. You've adapted, and you're not just doing the work. You're thinking about it. You're asking questions. You're making connections that others might miss." Elijah's heart skipped a beat. He had always thought of himself as someone who was just getting by, trying to stay out of the way. But here, in this moment, Maddox was telling him something different. He was telling him that he was capable of more than he had ever given himself credit for. "I've been working on something," Maddox continued. "A new project that could change the way we operate in this industry, and I want you to be part of it. Not just as a bystander, but as someone who can make a real impact." Elijah felt his breath catch in his throat. This was more than just a job offer. This was a challenge, an opportunity to prove not only to Maddox, but to himself that he belonged here. "I don't know if I'm ready for something like that," Elijah said, his voice hesitant. I'm just getting the hang of everything." Maddox smiled, leaning back in his chair. "That's the thing, Elijah. You're not here to get the hang of it. You're here to grow, to push yourself beyond the limits you've set for yourself. You've already shown that you're capable of more than most people give you credit for." Elijah looked at Maddox, his mind racing. This was what he had always wanted, wasn't it? The chance to prove himself, to show the world what he was made of. And here was his opportunity. It wasn't going to be easy. The world he had entered was full of challenges, of people who would always see him as the outsider. But it was also full of possibility. And with Maddox's belief in him, Elijah began to believe in himself too. "Okay," Elijah said, his voice steady now, the fear beginning to fade. "I'm in. I'll do it. I'll help you make this project a success." Maddox nodded, his eyes gleaming with approval. "That's what I like to hear. We've got a lot of work ahead of us, but I know you'll rise to the challenge." As Elijah left the office, a sense of excitement began to build within him. He wasn't just a waiter anymore. He wasn't just someone who had been pushed into a pool to be laughed at. He was someone who had been given the chance to change his life, to step into a world that had once seemed impossible. And now, for the first time, he felt ready. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be moments of doubt, moments when the weight of his past would threaten to hold him back. But Elijah knew one thing for certain. He was no longer the person who had walked into the Horizon that night. He was someone different, someone with a purpose, and with Richard Maddox by his side, he was ready to take on the world.